12, 15 years ago that there really wasn't enough or much information about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. But we all know that Oswald tried to start his own chapter in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. But when I was looking into who were the founding members, really the only list was 7 or 8 of the original. And I thought, well, there's got to be more than that. And then when I brought up the original list, there were 30 founding members. And in looking at the 30, there are usual names of Norman Mailer, Truman Capote, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre. But there were a lot of other names that were totally foreign to me. I had no idea who they were. And I suspected that people in the research community didn't know who they were either. So I started to look into them, and this is a work in progress. It's still underway. There's a lot that I'm looking into. Basically, I'm researching the lives of 30 people, looking into who they were, where they came from, their education, their background, anything to do with them, really. So just bear with me in that regards. So what I'm looking at is I'm going to give you a slide for each founding member. There's about 4 I haven't yet located with certainty. One of them was actually dead at the time of the FPCC's founding. I think it was just a throw-in to make the group look important. But also towards the end, I'm going to give about 2 or 3 extra slides of 5 of those founding members, because some of them just have very interesting lives behind them. All right, these are the founding members. You probably recognise a lot of them, but names such as G.A. Thurston, I don't think people knew who he was, Alan Sagner, Dan Wakefield, Robert F. Williams. These were all founding members, and they all had importance, although some of them, I'm certain they were just thrown into the mix to fill out to get to 30. I've also, at the bottom, I've got Vincent T. Lee and Miles Stewart. Vincent T. Lee came in as the head of the F.P.C.C. after Robert Tabor and Richard Gibson moved on to other things. And he came up from Tampa. And also Lyle Stewart. Lyle Stewart was the publisher for the F.P.C.C's literature. Right, this is Waldo Frank. As you can see, he was 70 years old at the time of the F.P.C.C's founding. Most of them weren't spring chickens. The youngest founding member was 28, and the oldest was 75, I believe. I've got a list at the end. As you can see, he was born in DeWitt, educated at DeWitt Clinton High School, as the 2 other founding members were. He went to Yale, and he also attended a writers' colony called Yaddo. 2 other founding members also went to a writers' colony. There's another one there whose name escapes me now, but it was quite common where they would go to the writers' colony, it's acreage and acreage, and they'd have their individual cabins, and they would just write. He was employed New Haven Courier-Journal, New York Evening Post, New York Times, and the Ellsworth County Leader. That's just some of his background. Now, you see, I've got another slide, 2 or 3 slides for him towards the end. Goes into a little bit more detail. Carlton Beals, he was the co-chairman. Now, he said that he was contacted by Robert Tabor, who was really the genesis of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And Carlton Beals was asked if he wanted to co-chair, and he kind of demurred, and he said, oh, let me have a look at the advertisement first, just to make sure that there are no communists in the committee. And Robert Tabor assured him profusely that there were no communists. So Robert Tabor sent him the advertisement before it was published, asked him to mark it up, to make corrections, any suggestions, what have you. And Carlton Beals received it, he did that, and he posted it back, but it was the very next day that the advertisement appeared in the New York Times. So Carlton Beals' corrections and suggestions never made it, because Robert Tabor was so, I guess, rushed to get the ad into print that he didn't give any consideration to Carlton Beals' suggestions. And he's travelled extensively throughout South America. He's really, when it comes to South America, him and Waldo Frank knew a lot. I think that's why they were probably approached by Robert Tabor. He's visited Cuba 2 or 3 times. He was a World War I draft debater. He's got my vote already. And he also worked as a correspondent at The Nation, which is where Robert Tabor worked at the time. James Baldwin, he's still in the news today. One of his books, If Beale Street Could Talk, has just been made into a movie. At the age of 35, he joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, but he really only lent his name to the organisation. I think it was Richard Gibson made a comment along the lines that he tried to get James more involved in the political side of the FPCC, but he just wasn't interested. It just didn't concern him. And in J. Michael Lennon's book, there's a quote by one of Baldwin's friends, and he made the comment that Baldwin would just lend his name to any organisation that asked him. So it's no surprising that he was on the list, but he wasn't involved in any way subsequent to the founding of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And also too, he knew a lot of people. If you read J. Michael Lennon's book, biography of James Baldwin, he knew just about everyone who was important in the 50s and 60s. He had an extensive list of friends. Yeah, the one about Gibson's quote, I tried to get him more involved, but he always avoided aligning himself politically. Simone de Beauvoir, French philosopher and writer. She was in an open relationship with Jean-Michel Sartre. They had visited Cuba in March of 1960, and the advertisement appeared in April of 1960. So I dare say that they would have been approached at the time that they were in the States. And he also, they spent time with Castro and Che Guevara whilst they were there. Frank London Brown, he seems a pretty cool kind of guy actually. He was an author, a journalist, a jazz musician, union organiser and a civil rights activist. He served in the US Army and he sang baritone in an army band before he got started in being political. He was also one of the first people to read his stories aloud accompanied by jazz music. No one had ever done that before, and he was more or less recognised as being the first person to do it. 54 to 57, he integrated into the nearly all-white area of Chicago called Trumbull Park. And he and his family and other African Americans in Trumbull Park were hassled on a daily basis for about 3 years by the whites in the area. They did not want them there. And based on his experience in Trumbull Park, he wrote a book about it. It was essentially truth, but it was written as non-fiction, with other characters named rather than himself and his wife and his friends. He died in 1962. He got a master's degree due to his thesis, The Myth Maker, which was a book. And then whilst working on his doctorate, he was diagnosed with leukemia and died in 1962, only age 34. Truman Capote, I'm sure we all know his face and name. He also attended the Writers' Colony of Yaddo in 1946. In 1956, whilst touring Russia, he was more or less there as an observer to the play Porgy and Bess. He went along to write about it. He ended up writing a book called The Muses Are Heard. And whilst he was there, he met and spent time with Priscilla Johnson, who only a few years later ended up interviewing Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know if they kept in contact after that. It's something I'm looking into. Now, he was also good friends with Lee Radziwill, JFK's sister-in-law. Truman Capote had a close-knit group of women friends, about 8 or 9 of them, and he referred to them as his squans. They were his favourites, and Lee Radziwill was one of those squans. And in 1987, in a book called Conversations, he said he only lent his name to the FPCC and he regretted signing the advertisement. John Henrik Clark, editor, lecturer, writer, historian and professor. In his youth, he caddied for Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, served in the US Army. It stands to reason that a lot of these people did serve in the US Army. It was 1960, it's only 14, 15 years after World War II and also after the war in Korea. So it seems, only fitting that a lot of those guys were in the Army. He also taught at the New School of Social Research, where some of the other founding members either studied or even lectured. Waldo Frank was a lecturer at the New School of Social Research. And he also lectured at the University of Ghana. And in 1962, he was an associate editor of Freedom Ways magazine. It was really a journal for African American literature and poems and social comment. They had their head office in the same building, 799 Broadway, which is where the Fair Play Peculiar Committee operated from. Professor Robert Garland Kolodny. He was 44 at the time, an author and university lecturer. He fought in the Spanish Civil War between 37 and 38. He was struck by a bullet during that conflict and he was partially paralysed and blinded. And he earned his doctorate in history at UC Berkeley in 1950. So he was quite being a professor, he's got a good head on his shoulders. He wasn't a left-wing radical by any sense of imagination. Richard Gibson, he's still alive. He's 88 now, I think, living in London. He earned his occupation as a writer. I had the opportunity last November to go to Washington, and I spent 2 days at George Washington University going through his papers, and there are 20 archive boxes of documents, and I was really stunned by the extent of the information that was there. Apparently, a university student was writing a thesis on Richard Gibson, and Richard Gibson donated all his personal papers, and they are personal papers. There are memos and documents from his wife, there's cards from his children, there's birthday cards from his mother, there's cards from his aunts and uncles just after he was born. There was even an envelope with a lock of his hair when he was 6 months old in there. And I was just stunned that they should, acquire it, and so now anyone can access it. But I want to get back to Richard Gibson. Unfortunately, I only had 2 days. I could only get through 8 of the 20 folders at the university. There's a ton of more information there. Like Dr. Maurice Green, I don't know, quite frankly. There are 3 Maurice Greens located in the 1961 Manhattan telephone directory. Now, the second one you can see is an MD. More than likely it's him, but I'm not going to assume that he's a medical doctor, this particular Dr. Maurice Green. He could very well be a doctor of mathematics or a doctor of animal husbandry for all I know. So it's a work in progress to find out who he was, where he was, and which Maurice Green was associated with the Fair Play Peculiar Committee. Edmund Haddad, he was one of the youngest at the age of 28. BA in journalism, telecommunications I should say, MA in public law and government. He worked with Robert Tabor at CBS, so he was there right from the beginning. And he also flew to Dallas on the evening of the assassination. He attended Oswald General News interview in the police basement auditorium on a Saturday morning. And he gave a statement to the FBI, but he made no mention of him being one of the founding members of the Fair Play Peculiar Committee. His questions more or less related to the security at the police headquarters. And he said there was no police headquarters, no security at police headquarters. He more or less had free rein to go where he wanted and whenever he wanted. Reverend Donald Xantho Harrington. He was 45 at the time. Clergyman, preacher. He was ordained as a minister in 1939. One of the founders of the American Committee on Africa. And he was also later, after the Fair Play Peculiar Committee, he was FDR Jr.'s running mate for New York City Lieutenant Governor. So he had an interest in politics for quite a while. And he was also Honorary Vice President and President of the United World Federalists from 1951 to 1955. And if memory serves me correct, I believe it was, I think Michael Payne was a member of the United World Federalists. So I don't know if there's any connection there at all, but again, that's something I'll be looking into. John Oliver Killens, 44-year-old writer. He was one of 4 co-founders of the Harlem Writers Guild. Now, I had never heard of this group until I started looking into John Oliver Killens. Now, what the Harlem Writers Guild was, a group of burgeoning writers and poets, and they would meet once a week in each member's homes, and they would critique each other's works. Everyone would get up and read aloud what they had written in the previous week, and then everyone would critique it and make comments. And that was generally the way that they got better at being a writer. One of the members at the Harlem Writers Guild was Maya Angelou. And I'll get to her a little bit later. But Maya Angelou, American poet, that's where she had her craft as a writer and poet really honed with the feedback she got at the Harlem Writers Guild. Sidney Lenz, union leader, legal activist and author. He, in reading through his testimony to the Eastland Committee, he's the sort of guy that didn't take shit from anyone. He was quite upfront in his comments to them. He wouldn't take any nonsense. His parents migrated from Minsk in the USSR. He changed his name in the mid-30s. He was originally named as Sidney Oakham, but he changed it to Sidney Lenz. And in March 1960, he received a long letter from Carlton Beals asking that he join the FPCC. There was 4 original members. They were responsible for the mail-out and the phone calls. And he formed the F.P.C.C. in Chicago with John Rawson. He was also a left-wing leader of the day. Norman Mailer, I'm sure you've all heard of him. Interesting character. There's a very interesting video called, it's a DVD called Mailer on Mailer. And in that he says that I'm a Marxist, I've always been a Marxist. So it seems only fitting that he was pulled into the group of the Fair Play to Cuba Committee. In November 1960, he stabbed his wife with a penknife, almost killing her. She was very seriously injured, and oddly enough, she stayed with him for a few more years, I don't know why. But he was also neighbour and close friend of Jacques Lowe. Yeah, he lived in Perry Street in New York, and Jacques Lowe and his wife, imagine if you walk out the front door of Norman Mailer's house, walk across the road and 5 doors down to the left, and that's where Jacques Lowe's house was. And one of his wives, Mailer was married 6 times, one of his wives said that the Lowes were closer than family. That's how well they knew of each other. In 1969 he ran for mayor of New York, but wasn't successful. I'm sorry for the tiny print. It just happened that way. I couldn't fix it without going way off the screen, so my apologies. He served in the US Army in 1946. He joined the Communist Party in his early 20s. In 1948 he moved to New York. And he also co-founded Mexico's first English language radio station. Now in June 1961, you can see with there, I've got the asterisks, he helped Robert F. Williams supply rifles, pistols and submachine guns to African Americans in Monroe, Alabama, who were, Monroe, North Carolina, who were victims of racial discrimination. Robert F. Williams, we'll get to soon, he was quite a radical in his day. He was wanted by the FBI, and he ended up writing a book called Negroes with Guns. And he became an influence on the founding members of the Black Panthers, because his attitude was, don't take it lying down, armed resistance. So he was helpful to, Julian Mayfield was helpful to Robert F. Williams with weapons. And oddly enough, he was allowed back in, and he was a visiting professor at the University of Maryland. He was a writer in residence at Howard University, despite his background in joining the Communist Party and using weapons. Elva Depew Matthews. I've spent a lot of time researching Elva. I'll get to her in a more detailed biography soon, but she was born into wealth in 1889. Her father was Edgar James Depew. He owned the equivalent of, the storage units we have around, for people who have got stuff in the storage. He owned about anywhere between, I've heard several dozen, I've also heard he owned about 100 of them up and down the coast of California in the late 1800s. So she had a lot of money at her disposal. I remember when her father died in the Spanish flu outbreak in 1918. He died in January 1919. She inherited a ton of money, and she more or less spent the rest of her life trying to crack it as a writer. She wrote extremely well, but her works just really weren't accepted. I'll get to her later. The dead guy, Professor Eugene Noble. I've only been able to find one Professor Eugene Noble. He was a teacher, and he was also one on the board of the Juilliard Acting School. He died in 1948. So I just think he was the throwaway to try and make it look like they had some really notable people on their list being a professor. But he'd been deceased for some 12 years prior to that. And on one of the research sites that I'm using for the newspaper sites, I asked them to send me regular updates for when they've located anything to do with Professor Eugene Noble. And I've gone into it and there's nothing new. It's the same dead guy. So whether he had a relative by that name or there was Professor Eugene Noble Jr., I don't know. But at this stage, he's the dead guy. Reverend John Papandrew, again another minister. He served in the US Army. He flew 50 combat missions over Eastern Europe as a tail gunner. So it seems unusual being a minister who's quite prepared to kill people. Educated at the University of New Hampshire, Harvard Divinity School, ordained as a Unitarian minister, and he was also a member of the ACLU and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he was arrested with Martin Luther King. When he got arrested, he was one of the, I don't know how many there were, 3 or 4 who got arrested. Well, he was along there with Martin Luther King in the March on Montgomery. James Otis Purdy. He was 45 at the time of the founding of the Fair Play Committee, and he spoke and taught 3 languages, English, French and Spanish. A few of the other founding members also spoke French, so that seemed to be a common pull to them. He received his MA in English at the University of Chicago, studied Spanish at the University of Chicago, and he even taught English in Havana, Cuba in the mid-40s. And he wrote his final novel at the age of 92. So he was still going strong. Joseph Quintana. I haven't found anything for this gentleman at all. The only reference I can find, there was a Mexican artist by that name in the late 1950s, and that's about it. I can't find any information on him at all. So I don't know whether it's the same gentleman or perhaps a made-up name. I don't know. So I'm still looking into him. Alan Sagner. He was a wealthy property developer, and he only died about 18 months ago, in his 90s. He was behind the forming of the Fair Play Cuba Committee, and it's generally believed that he coined the term the Fair Play Cuba Committee. What actually happened was that Robert Tabor wrote an article in The Nation. Alan Sagner replied to Robert Tabor, and they agreed that they should meet, and subsequent to that meeting went from 2 members to 3 and then later to 30. And he ended up becoming a member of a group whose name escapes me, but also Ted Sorensen was on that group as well. It was only about maybe 20 years ago. Jean-Paul Sartre. He's the partner of Simone de Beauvoir, or was. They lived in an open relationship. You know, in the late 1940s, what's not generally known is that there was an expat community of authors and writers and poets and artists in Paris. A lot of them African American, because they did not receive any racial discrimination in Paris. They felt very free there. So in that milieu of people, that's where he met Truman Capote, Richard Wright, Buford Delaney, it actually is pronounced Buford, and James Baldwin in Paris. He visited Cuba with de Beauvoir, and he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964. John Andrew Singleton. It took me a little while to find this gentleman. He was active in politics in his local area in Queens, and also in Nebraska, where he was born. He moved to New York in 1933 and was president of the Omaha and New York NAACP, and also elected to the NAACP Board of Directors. You know, Robert Franklin Williams would have known him, so I suspect he may have been brought into it by Robert Franklin Williams, who was one of the leaders of the NAACP. Robert Tabor, this is the guy who really kind of sparked it all off. What's not generally known is that he had a criminal record some 20 odd years prior. He was arrested in Ohio and entered a plea of guilty to armed robbery, auto larceny and kidnapping. And what they actually did was, he and one of his mates, they stopped a 15-year-old kid who was driving, I dare say it was probably his dad's car. They mugged him, stole $8 from him and tied him to a tree, and then they drove off. And there was a chase of about, it wasn't far, maybe 500 metres or 100 metres down the road. Yeah, but the police chased them, arrested them, and he was sentenced to 30 years prison, but he got released after 3 years. So he spent some time in jail for his troubles. Now, he personally placed the FPCC ad at the offices of the New York Times. He was being really quite vague when he was testifying before the Eastland Committee. He was trying not to give too much away. But he told Charles Santos Bush, and Charles Santos Bush was the Cuban delegate at the Cuban mission in New York. And Charles Santos Bush said that he could get the money, and Tabor told him, I don't want to know where you get the money from, basically. And it actually came from Rolito Roa on the Cuban government. Now, he also said he said that Richard Gibson helped him get some of the names of the phone calls and mail-outs. He was executive secretary of the F.P.C.C. And in January 1961, he left for Cuba with $90,000 of F.P.C.C. money. He just shot through at a moment's notice. And that was generally believed because he was facing perjury charges. Some things he said to the Eastland Committee, rather than actually face the music, he grabbed 90 grand and took off. He did eventually come back about a year later. And when he came back, he didn't want to talk about the FPCC. People tried to elicit more information about it, but he said, no, I'm not basically talking about it. Now, this is what I call the letter. When I was in Washington, I was going through Richard Gibson's paperwork, and I found a letter addressed to Richard Gibson from Lyle Stewart. And basically it says, Dear Dick, your second article is on press, but a subsequent issue of The Independent was all dummied up with an article by you. Would you keep them coming if you can at a rate so that when you see one before the last, you know it's time for another. Thus, when you saw the first one, it was time to read the third article. So it's basically a finger wag, trying to get Richard Gibson to write another article. And he says, we're planning a convention in Europe for the office staff, so I'll be in London with about 20 people in September. Please don't tell your CIA employers yet. Now, bear in mind that Richard Gibson was generally not trusted. In the 1950s, I'll get to that in a little while, but in the 1950s, Richard Gibson was in Paris, and the Paris community just didn't like him, didn't trust him, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Now, with Robert Tabor, his trips to Cuba, he'd spent a lot of time going there. You see there, he made 11 trips from February 57 to, say, approximately mid-1960. But that's a lot of trips going to and from Cuba. He also attended the wedding of Castro's sister, and he said he'd never received any money from the Cuban government and had never been a member of the CPUSA, the Communist Party of USA. Whether he was or he wasn't, I don't know, but he certainly had a lot of friends in the Castro government. Now, George Albert Thurston, I had no idea who he was. He shows up on the list of members as G.A. Thurston. So when I first saw the name, I didn't know whether it was George or Gary or Georgia Elise Thurston. So I put it away for a while, came back to it, and what I did, I bought some books written by Robert Tabor. He's written about 3 or 4 books, and more often than not, as you know, the flyleaf in the books often have biographical information. In one of his books, called M26, Autobiography of a Revolution, he dedicates the book to George Albert Thurston. That's where it is, right at the very front. So I knew the full name. I then searched on George Albert Thurston. Turns out he's the father-in-law of Robert Tabor. So I think his name was probably added to the list purely as adding an extra name, you know, make a phone call, hey, Dad, can you join? Something he did. Other than that, not a lot is known. He was a commercial artist in New York. He used to draw things like, you see the postcards, the picture postcards in New York that have been colourised. Rather than people actually taking photographs and making postcards, George Thurston was the kind of guy who would draw a building and then colour it, and that would be then sold as postcards in mass market. And he died in 1964. Kenneth Tynan, he was a drama critic, a writer. He's probably more known here than in America, I suspect. His appearance before the Eastland Committee really rattled him. You can see where I put the asterisks. The ad appeared on the 6th of April 1960. On the 27th of April, he was handed a subpoena to appear before the Eastland Committee. He testified on the 5th of the 5th, about a week to 10 days later. On the 22nd of the 5th, he gave a farewell party, and on the 24th of the 5th, he left America. So within a period of something like 5 weeks, 6 weeks, his name appeared on the advertisement. His friends and family at the time said he was extremely rattled, and that unnerved him, so he just packed up his bags and left. And he ended up going back to England. And also, he was a major contributor in the sense of ideas for that stage play of O Calcutta in the early 70s. It's even, I remember that at the time, all the fuss that created. He worked, you know, pulled in ideas from even John Lennon, interesting ideas that he had. But that was his contribution as a drama critic. He wanted to get his own production on stage, and O Calcutta was it. And he was also the general belief to be the first person to use that profanity on national TV. So.
Not the last. Normal now.
And Dan Wakefield, he's an author. He's still alive. I tried getting some information out of him about 3 years ago. I emailed him and he just didn't reply. So he's not interested in discussing it. But in his book, there's an asterisk in the middle there. He wrote a book called New York in the 50s. Basically, it was his experiences in growing up in New York in the 1950s. And he says, I was trying to woo an uptown beauty, and I was trying to think of ways to impress her when I received an invitation to a cocktail party where I'd meet Jean-Michel Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. I called the object of my affections and dropped the names of the Parisian dynamic duo. Would she like to meet them over cocktails? You bet. So he went to this cocktail party ostensibly to impress this woman that he was trying to woo, not with any intention of joining any political group. And he ended up joining the Fair Play Peculiar Committee. And as he said, when I saw the full-page ad on it, full-page ad with my name on it, I felt that inquisia. And I sat down and wrote a long letter resigning from the Fair Play Peculiar Committee. So essentially, he was only a member, a founding member, for a matter of weeks, I suspect. He had no intention of joining. He was just there to impress a woman he was chasing. And he also wrote another couple of books, Going All the Way and Starting Over, which have been made into major movies. Sidney Weinstein, again, I don't know. There was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party named Sylvia Weinstein. I don't know whether Sylvia is related to Sidney, but I can't find any information for this gentleman whatsoever. But it's just a matter of digging. I'm sure I'll find something sometime. But as at now, no, I haven't. This is Robert Franklin Williams. I'm going to give a bit more information about him a bit later. But he was a former Marine, a civil rights leader, a militant leader, and head of the Monroe, North Carolina NAACP. And I think he was probably brought into the fold, if you will, of the FPCC through John Killens, because he knew him through the NAACP. He used to visit him a lot in the 1950s. This is Vincent Theodore Lee, or Ted Lee, as he was known. Now, his birth documents don't give the middle name. It's just Vincent T. Lee. So I've only went my went along the lines of Harry S. Truman, whether the S didn't stand for anything. In this instance, the T didn't stand anything, but he told everyone his preferred name was Ted. Now, there are shipping manifests for a Vincent T. Lee, born in the same year and the same town as him, where he was in the Merchant Marines. And one of them, in 1945, it says his nationality is stated as being Scandinavian. So I don't know whether that was just a ruse or whether his parents were Scandinavian, but that's what it was listed as. He was in the Air Transport Manifest as a private, and he was also on board the US vessel Henry C. Wallace on his return from Venezuela. He appeared before the Eastland Committee, and he was being, again, circumspect. I think he was probably scared shitless and he didn't want to give too much away. But in the 8th of December issue of Detroit Free Press, it stated that he's an ex-GI, a former secretary of the Tampa ACLU. He previously lived in Brooklyn. He attended a military academy in New Jersey and had a 2-year military career ending in 1956. I haven't yet looked into which military academy, but that's one thing that I'll be doing because I want to know more about that. Now, these were the founding members who appeared before the Eastland Committee. Waldo Frank, Carlton Beals, Robert Tabor twice, Richard Gibson, Kenneth Tynan, Sidney Lenz, Vincent T. Lee, and I'm fairly certain Alan Sagner was. I can visualise the page from the Eastland Committee document, but I couldn't find it. I was racing around at home looking for it to confirm it, and I just could not locate it. So that's why I've got a question mark. I'm fairly certain that he did appear before the Eastland Committee. All right, how it came to be. Once all these 30-odd people came together, and now what's generally not known is that their friendships go back decades. Just as we all, the 6 degrees of separation, no different to these guys. Some knew each other, some had never met. Okay. 23rd of January 1960, Robert Tabor, he wrote the article Castro's Cuba in The Nation. And that was, as it says, a copy was found amongst Oswald's possessions in Irving. Alan Sagner read the article, along with an article by Waldo Frank and a letter to the editor. Alan Sagner, a builder and investor in The Nation, phoned Robert Tabor, stated he'd agreed with Tabor's sentiments and it was agreed that they would meet. At the same time, Waldo Frank wrote a letter to Tabor in response to the article. February and March, an initial meeting was held at an unnamed Spanish restaurant on 8th Avenue near 51st Street. Alan Sagner, he couldn't recall which one it was, neither could Robert Tabor, but they generally believed it was a Spanish restaurant. And there's also a follow-up meeting at Robert Tabor's apartment. Now it says there, the party was also held in a hotel honouring Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, in which guests were asked to join the FPCC. And Dan Wakefield was one of those attendees who joined. Now, Alan Sagner, Waldo Frank and Robert Tabor were the 3 protagonists in getting more people to join. And they sent out approximately 200 letters, and they also phoned people that they knew or knew about. And recipients included Ernest Hemingway and Eleanor Roosevelt. They both declined to join, obviously. And on the 6th of April, the advertisement was published on page 33 of the New York Times. That's the ad as it appeared. There's a little bit cropped off at the bottom. It wouldn't fit on my scanner, unfortunately, so apologies. But that's basically it. On the left-hand side, you can see the list of names. And the essential thrust of the advertisement was that Q is getting a bad name in the press, and it's unwarranted. And as we would say back home in Australia, is give them a fair go, give them fair play. That essentially was the thrust of the ad. They just wanted the truth to be told about what was happening in Cuba, because that wasn't being provided. Now, there's 3 sources for the funding of it. The ad cost $4,700.
A lot of money.
Sorry?
That was a lot of money. back
Yeah,
then.
it was. Yeah, well, it was a full-page ad. It was like this. The New York Times was not a small newspaper. It was like a tabloid. It was huge.
About 50
or
grand.
broadsheet, actually.
War.
Well, $3.5 grand was paid by Dr. Charles Santos Bush to Robert Taylor the day before the New York Times published the advertisement. Now, Robert Taylor, again, he wasn't, you could tell he wasn't telling the full story. Basically said that he met Robert Taylor and Charles Santos Bush met outside the United Nations the day before the advertisement got published, and Charles Santos Bush handed over a cheque for $3.5 grand, made payable to the New York Times. There was also a collection at the community church in New York. Now, what's not generally known is that at the Harlem Writers Guild, they were asked to contribute towards it. She said that when she was at one of her very first attendances at the Harlem Writers Guild, John Killens, who was the founder of the Harlem Writers Guild, at the end of, when everyone was having their work critiqued, he stood up at the front and asked people to make a donation, and if you want to join, sign the form at the back. So Maya Angelou went towards the back of the room to sign the form and make a contribution. Her form had already been filled in. All she had to do was to sign it and donate, which she did. She donated. So I think perhaps, yes, she probably was one of the original members, but her name wasn't listed. That was probably to her betterment for that reason. This was their twofold policy. To engender to the United States, or in the United States, a broader and better understanding of US-Cuban relations with the object of improving those relations. And two, to this end, to publish and disseminate factual information, opinions and evaluations related to Cuba, the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution. Basically, just tell it as it is, don't bullshit. Now, how do they do that? They were really quite proliferate in their literature. They had three main journals. There was the Fair Play, the one on the left. That was for everybody out on the street. Anyone who joined would receive that. If people just wanted to receive that on a regular basis, they could. They didn't have to be a member. The Student Council was aimed at university students. As is typical, university students, they're the radical youth of the day. They were encouraged to learn more about the Fair Play to Cuba Committee through their own specific magazine. Now, the Student Council was led by a guy named Saul Landau, who was a left-leaning student, and he ended up going on to produce a lot of documentaries about South America. And also the Cuban Press Survey, and that's only tiny. The other ones are A4 size. The Cuban Press Survey is probably about that big. There's a small pink sheet that's been folded over a few times to make about 4-6 pages in general. I don't know why that was done since they had Fair Play.
Phil, what was Oswald handing out in New Orleans then?
He was handing out a small green and white brochure. I think it was it written by Clifford Odets, I think, from memory. I've got one of those at home, and it's only tiny, it's pocket size.
It's an advert, was it, for...
No, it was actually a little booklet.
Did he print those himself?
No. Yeah, well, I guess if he had them, ostensibly he obtained them from the Fair Play to Cuba Committee, perhaps, but I don't know. Now this is my collection. The next few slides are my collection of material. And you can see that they were quite proliferate in their literature. It wasn't just the newsletters. They had a literature list where you could buy. You could also buy a little red badge with, free Cuba on it, or hands off Cuba. And they also published their own material as well as rubber stamping other people's material. They were often at the back of these books, you would see a stamp, Fair Play to Cuba Committee, $7.99 Broadway. And to answer your question, Stuart, if you have a look at the right-hand side in the middle, you see the little green and white booklet.
Oh, yes.
That's what Oswald was handing out. And again, this is some more literature. They had a lot. They were really keen on pushing the Fair Play to Cuba idea to people. protest parties and picnics. They were very much a social group as well. They were organising parties, Central Invasion Agency, picket and protest. What I didn't include was a map at one of the, they also had a picnic, and it gave directions and a map to a member's home. They're going to have a full day picnic at this person's home. Again, more. And also the Philadelphia chapter, that document on the left, says we in the Philadelphia chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee also share the spirit of getting out. And they did. They were having picnics, Spanish classes as well, for those who wanted it. If they wanted to be taught Spanish, they were arranging that. Also inviting, speakers. Robert F. Williams, one of the founding members, he was giving regular speeches. And also William Worthy, Herbert Matthews. They were organising protests in various cities around the country. And the group on the right, it's got 29th of August 63, returning students from Cuba. That was just a small handful. There was about 300 students which went on that particular trip to Cuba. And they did it for the princely sum of $100. So it was dirt cheap, and with the students, they were no doubt quite interested.
Free trip.
Okay, Lyle Stewart. His birth name was Lionel Simon, but he changed it later in life. Dropped out of Phl High School and joined the Merchant Marines. He was arrested in 1942 for attempted extortion. In 1951, he launched Expose magazine, and one of the contributors was Norman Mailer. So I dare say that Lyle Stewart and Norman Mailer were mates from the early 1950s on. And generally what he was doing, Expose wasn't a porn magazine as far as I'm aware, it was just exposing to the community news that you don't usually get in the mainstream media. And Lyle Stewart was known for that. He would publish books that other publishers wouldn't touch. He was assaulted in 1954. He was just mailing some letters out to his subscribers, and he got bashed for doing that. He published Fidel Castro's History Will Absolve Me. So he was left-leaning and publishing material that no one else would touch. Now, Alan Sagner, this is the builder and property developer. He was originally in the rag trade. His family business was suits, and you can see ads in old New York magazines for Sagner suits. And he did initially start off in the family business, but he realised it wasn't his cup of tea, and he broke into being a builder and a property developer. And he started a building company, Levin Sagner, with his brother-in-law, Martin Levin. And they were very successful. They'll buy huge blocks of land, subdivide it, build houses on it, and then sell them. And he made a fortune. He was a multi-millionaire when he died about 18 months ago. Now there's a video on YouTube, and he was asked about Fair Play to Cuba Committee, and again you could tell he just didn't want to talk about it, but he just said that, look, it was going in a direction I didn't agree with, so I left. And that was about a year afterwards. The founding members who are still alive, they don't want to talk about it. You've got Alan Sagner doesn't want to talk about it, Dan Wakefield doesn't want to talk about it, Richard Gibson doesn't want to talk about it. In one of Richard Gibson's biographies that he wrote, he lists everything he's ever done, except there's a gap for Fair Play to Cuba. It's just not mentioned at all. Now, he testified at the Eastland Committee and said it was he, Robert Tabor and Waldo Frank who wrote to people we knew or personally knew about. So they were the three protagonists in getting more people into it. Now, over the years, after he left the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, at the 1960 Democratic National Convention, he was a volunteer for Adlai Stevenson. He was the finance chairman for Brendan Burns' bid for New Jersey governor. In '84, he was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. Now, what's not generally known is that his second marriage was to a woman named Lenore Green Schottenstein. She just happens to be the niece of Phl Hopley, who was the former CIA station chief in Moscow at the head of SR-10 in the late 1950s. That was at a time when Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. So I don't know how long they knew each other, but given her middle name is Lenore Green, I don't know whether that's a family name or whether she's related to the Dr. Morris Green I'm having trouble with. But in the 1961 Manhattan telephone book, there is a Lenore Green who lives just across the road and about 100 metres down from a Dr. Morris Green. So they could very well be related, but again, it's a common surname. So it might just be a coincidence that they were within close proximity to each other. And he went on to be the chairman of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So he got quite a lot done in New York. All right, Richard Gibson. Interesting character. He's still alive. He's in his 80s. Now, I've made reference to the documents that were released late last year. There's a lot of pages on Richard Gibson. And in those documents, although they don't mention Gibson by name, it's obviously him that they are speaking about. He made his first approach to the CIA in 1950, which was some 10 years before he had any involvement with the F.P.C.C. He studied in Rome on a scholarship, the John H. Whitney Scholarship Award. He worked in the Mediterranean News Bureau of the Christian Science Monitor. He'd spent time in the army, and when he left the army, he studied at the Sorbonne and US GI Bill, working for Agence France Presse, I think it's pronounced. Now, in late 1957, he became embroiled in what was called the Gibson Affair. It's an interesting story in that one of the expats living in Paris was a political cartoonist named Ollie Harrington. And Ollie Harrington had a flat in Paris, and he wanted to rent that out whilst he was going back to England for about a year. So he rented it to Richard Gibson. Upon Harrington's return, Richard Gibson made it quite clear he wasn't going to budge. He was, had his ass prints in the furniture, he wasn't moving. Harrington also found that a lot of his clothes that he left behind had been sold by Richard Gibson. And he didn't have access to his furniture, his personal possessions, and it got so bad that Ollie Harrington bashed the crap out of Richard Gibson, and he was hospitalised for a month as a result. And the general feeling at the time was that Gibson couldn't be trusted. The expat community in Paris at the time felt that he was either FBI or CIA. They just couldn't prove it. Now, he left Paris in 1957, just after he was attacked by Ollie Harrington. And he started employment at CBS Radio News. Now, he was the guy who was behind the scenes writing the script for the radio journalists. That was his job, and he would then pass it on to the radio guys. And his colleagues included Robert Tabor and Edmund Haddad, so they knew each other from the days at CBS. Because of his involvement with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, CBS asked him to resign. They didn't like his affiliation with the F.P.C.C. They felt it was against their values, so he was asked to leave, and he did. Although he was on a scholarship at the time, and even though he'd resigned from the F.P.C.C., from CBS, they still allowed him to continue his scholarship. He was interviewed twice by the Eastland Committee. He was one of the founders of the Révolution Africaine, I think I pronounced that correctly. And in 1965, he arrived in London, and that's where he's been ever since.
Have you tried to make contact with him?
Yeah, I tried emailing him years ago, no response. I believe Jefferson Morley has tried contacting him recently, and his secretary answered the phone, and the response was that Mr. Gibson has nothing to say.
Excuse me, he's a neighbour of Bill's. Bill? Who's calling? Bill? Doesn't Richard Gibson live near you? No? There was definitely somebody at one talk I gave, I thought it was Bill, it might have been somebody else, a few years ago, and I thought it was Bill. Somebody told me there within DPUK that he actually was a neighbour of Richard Gibson in London.
Hmm?
Yeah, well, he's quiet now. I know that there's a book written by Van Gogh called Where the Boys Are about the New Left in the 1950s and 1960s, and there's about 60 to 70 pages on the Fair Play Peculiar Committee. And Van Gogh was in contact with Richard Gibson by letter. So he was responsive back then. I think this was in the early 90s when Van Gogh was writing his dissertation, which became Where the Boys Are. But he's just clammed up. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. Whether the CIA have clamped his voice on the matter, because in the CIA documents that have been released, it said that Gibson's concern was long-term employment and retirement benefits if he joined the CIA. So they had a financial hold over him. And he did end up becoming an informant for the CIA. As I said, he was paid $3,100 between 25th of January and the 14th of June 65. And that's the equivalent of about approximately $25,000 in today's money. And that continued. He had the CIA name of GP Phone, and I believe there's another one called Sugar. He had two names. So he was a long time informant for them. So given that he's now very quiet, I'm wondering whether perhaps they lent on him and told him to keep your mouth shut because he spoke with Van Gogh in the 90s. Yeah, still living in London, and he's been a director of several companies called the Handon Trust, the YAC Arts, the YAA Assanti Arts and Community. So he's involved in all these, I guess, African companies.
Charities, probably.
And he also wrote a lot of articles for the Liberator magazine. I won't go through all of those, but Liberator was issued every month, and it was aimed at the African Americans in America. And he started to write for them from April 1963 onwards. And down the bottom you can see that there were other members of the Fair Play Peculiar Committee who were somehow involved with Liberator. But John Henry Clark, James Baldwin, Julian Mayfield, John Killens, Robert F. Williams, Robert Tabor, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Is this Robert Franklin Williams? Excuse me. Now, he looks like a fun, upstanding member of the community. He was a Marine in his youth. He witnessed the riots in Detroit, which killed 43 people. It was just mayhem. He worked at the Ford Motor Company at the time, drafted into the Army in 1944 and sent to Fort Bragg. On his release, he joined the local NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina, and for 2 years he was a contributor to the Daily Worker, whose name we all know. He became a member of the National Rifle Association. He joined the US Marines and served 6 months in the brig for refusing to salute the US flag. He more or less had contempt for the United States because of the way he was treated. He was black. In those days, blacks were given short shrift. And he helped with the release from jail of 2 young African-American boys accused of raping a 7-year-old white girl. And it became known as the kissing case. And basically all it was, there was this 7-year-old girl, and she knew one of the African-American kids. So she decided to give him a kiss on the cheek because she hadn't seen him in a while. The other boy, he went home and told his mother that his friend had kissed a white girl on the cheek. That mother then complained to the police. The police ended up arresting the 2 boys. There's photographs of the boys, on their release. And they were accused of rape. They're only kids, but all they did was just receive a kiss from this white girl. Robert F. Williams, he stepped in and helped to get these boys released because they were in jail for about, I think about 10 to 14 days, which as kids, that would have been terrifying for them. And he said, since the federal government will not bring a halt to lynching in the South, and since the so-called courts lynch our people legally, if it's necessary to stop lynching with lynching, then we must be willing to resort to that method. We must meet violence with violence. And that comment was influential in the Black Panther group in starting. When they got going, I think it was Eldridge Cleaver, he said that of the three people who influenced him the most, one of them was Robert Franklin Williams. Now, he published the Crusader magazine as about so big, folded out, very thin tissue paper-like material. And long story short, he ended up being wanted by the FBI. He visited Cuba in 1960, but he ended up escaping America. He ended up going from, because of an incident as a member of the NAACP, in Monroe where he lived, it was a racist town, and he was the chapter head of the NAACP, or the president of the NAACP, and he had issues with the Ku Klux Klan, and the Klan had issues with him. And on one particular evening, there was a white couple, husband and wife, returning home, and they took a wrong turn and ended up going into a violent black district of Monroe. And the crowds were throwing stones at their car, they were rocking in the car, and it just happened to be outside Robert Franklin Williams' house. He went out, rescued this couple from their car and brought them into his house. And apparently, I don't know why, but the wife was saying, "Help, we're being kidnapped." And this is when he was trying to save them from being lynched, no doubt. He held them in the house for a while to save them from the crowd. And he was armed, ready to use weapons against his own community to save these people. But when it became apparent that the crowds weren't dissipating, and then the state troopers were called in, he and his wife escaped. Morris escaped out the back door into the woods, and meeting through an underground community of people. He ended up going from his home in Monroe up to, I think he went to Ontario and Toronto in Canada. He's worked his way back down through Washington State, and then down to Mexico, and then from Mexico over to Cuba. So this long, circuitous route to get away. It might have been a bit extreme, but he felt that it was useless, so he just shot off over into Cuba, and he was welcomed with open arms when he got to Cuba. And he broadcast his radio show called Radio Free Dixie from Havana into the southern United States. Not unlike, back in the 60s where you had the pirate radio off the coast of England, he was doing that from Cuba. And the broadcast was primarily aimed at the southern states, but on those good days with the right weather conditions, his broadcast actually got as far as Canada. So he was, I guess, the thorn in the side of the US government from Havana. And in 1966, he moved to China with his wife, Mabel, at the invitation of Mao Zedong. There are photographs of them being greeted and hugged by Mao when he got over there. And he was, 2 years later, he was elected president in exile of the Republic of New Africa. It was a group of African Americans who decided that they're going to create a new country, and they wanted it to be in America, and they made Robert Franklin Williams their president. He said later that he didn't really care for it too much. He didn't care, it was just his name attached to it, so he didn't really have much to do with that at all. And he returned to the United States in 1969 with the help of Richard Nixon. As you may recall, in the early 1970s, Richard Nixon was instrumental in reinvigorating good relations with China, and Robert Franklin Williams, through his contacts, more or less said, "Well, I can help you with that. I know a lot about the Chinese government, I know people, so if you let me back in, I'll help you with that." And they did. He wasn't actually given a pardon, but they kind of looked the other way, and he was allowed to come back to America. And he continued to work as a civil rights activist, speaker and author until his death in 1996.
3 minutes, Phil.
Yep. Well, I can end now if you like.
Okay, well.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yep, all right, and we'll come back to this after the break. Everyone. Now, Waldo Frank, he was one of the co-chairmen along with Carlton Beals. Now, he was friends with F.P.C.C. co-founder Albert Hugh Matthews since 1917. I was able to get copies of her correspondence from 1917 to 1967. Waldo Frank died in 1967, Waldo Frank, I should say, died in 67, and Albert the Pugh Matthews was a long time writer to him. They were really good friends. They both lived in New York but at other ends of town, so they contacted each other by phone and by letter. Now, he was also a former communist and contributed to the New Masses magazine in the 20s and 30s. Now, the New Masses was a left-leaning magazine. It was, I guess, the child of a magazine called The Masses, which was published in the late teens, but it was shut down by the US government. So they resurrected it in the form of the New Masses, and it continued on for another 12 years. You can see his list of where he attended university and where he was a reporter for. And in 1920, he apparently had a mystical experience and converted to Judaism. He was a contributing editor of the New Masses, along with Floyd Bell, Eugene O'Neill. He also made a trip to Cuba and the Isle of Pines. Now, you can see back then, in the 1920s, the New Masses had their head office at 799 Broadway. So when the Fair Play to Cuba Committee came along in 1960, he was no stranger to the building of 799 Broadway. That's their book service. Now, I had the opportunity to go to New York in November, and 799 Broadway, it's a former hotel which was converted to an office building in around about 1916, 1917, at the time of the First World War. And the building's now been demolished. A 6-storey building, and I was walking past, and it's all boarded up, scaffolding and green mesh, and I happened to ask one of the workers there, what's going on? I thought it might have been being refurbished. And this middle-aged gentleman who couldn't speak much English, when I was trying to convey to him, what's happening, he was just saying, down, down. And I said, what, you mean demolished? And he said, yes, demolish, demolish. And it's probably gone already. I checked online, and what's going up in this place can only be described as a steel and glass monstrosity. It's really not happy. And even some of the locals in New York who are more inclined to have the older buildings maintained and retained, because that's part of New York, these old buildings. But these new glass ones are going up, and they really couldn't fight it. It's been purchased by a multi-million-dollar corporation, and they've decided to demolish it. And you see 1929, he did a lecture tour of Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Cuba. So he's well versed in what's happening in South America. He toured Russia in 1931, and he was speaker at the Friends of the Soviet Union meeting. 1932, his article, Where I Stand and How I Got Here, How I Came to Communism. So he was involved in left-leaning politics fairly early on in the piece. In 1937, though, he severed relations with the Communist Party. And in 1942, when he was in Buenos Aires, he was hospitalised. He was assaulted by fascists. And in 1947, he delivered over 100 lectures on a coast-to-coast tour of America, speaking about South America. Named honorary professor by the Central University of Ecuador. And in 1954, started a monthly syndicated series of essays for Latin American periodicals. And in 1960, that was June, the Fair Play to Cuba Committee formed in April 1960. In June 1960, he visited Cuba and also met with Fidel Castro. Now, what's important, in 1963, he was questioned by the Eastland Committee about the F.P.C.C. He said, I loaned my name to what I considered and still consider a good cause, and I went back to my own business. Frank also said he didn't know if the F.P.C.C. was in existence or not. So he was asked to sign it by Robert Taylor. He did, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. He had no further involvement with it. Although I think he did give one speech in October or November of 1960, but that was about it. That's Waldo Frank holding up the English and Spanish versions of the New York Times ad. As you can see, it's quite a large broadsheet. Albert the Pugh Matthews. I've spent a lot of time researching this lady. Born into wealth in 1889 in San Francisco, Alameda County, and that's important. Alameda County. Her father owned Yolo Orchards. He was president of the California prison system, and he owned dozens of storage facilities up and down the California coast. He also knew the founder of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The family was very well connected, very wealthy. Years later, I won't say years later, in her early 20s, Elba DePuy Matthews was a bridesmaid at a wedding of a woman named Agnes Tillman. Now, Agnes Tillman also came from a wealthy San Francisco family, and Agnes Tillman ended up marrying Baron Van Eck, who was the founder of Shell Oil in America. So she ended up dying in the 80s, I think. But that just goes to show that they were very well connected in their communities. She spoke only French for the first 5 years of her life. She was raised in Alameda County in San Francisco. Her father owned a mansion on 100 acres, and she had a governess to teach her the first 5 years of her life. She ended up being educated in her early teens. I guess it's best described as a finishing school for young ladies, a woman named Elizabeth Murison. She had her own private little school, and Elba contributed to the school journal called The Serpent. She wrote a couple of articles and also drew it. Educated at the University of California, Harvard, Columbia, and the New School for Social Research again, where a lot of the other members had their education and or lecturing. Her first play, Hattie, was produced in New York by the Washington Square Players. I've got a copy of it and I've read it, but one of the reviewers of the day, he wasn't overly complimentary. He just described it as dreary, and then he moved on to somebody else. So I don't know. Married Warren Shepherd Matthews in June 1918 in San Francisco. Now, I believe they met in their common interest in plays. Warren Shepherd Matthews educated at Princeton. He was involved in the Princeton Players, and he also got involved in the Provincetown Players, where the likes of Eugene O'Neill got his start. And she, no doubt, had a similar interest in plays and playwrights, and they met and married. The only child, Rowena, was born in 1923, and they divorced in May 1937. I think, though, the trouble in the marriage was going for some time. In one of her letters, Elba wrote to Waldo Frank saying that she really should have got divorced in 1924, but it carried on. And in one of her letters in May 1937, she says, "Finally, my divorce came through the day before yesterday." So it took a good 13 years for that to transpire. And she never remarried. Elba was close friends with Waldo for over 50 years. She contributed to Waldo's magazine, The Seven Arts, and The Figure in the Carpet. There's, on the front page of the Seven Arts magazine, there's Elba DePuy and Waldo Frank, and in the other journals, The Figure in the Carpet, there's about 4 of those, I believe. She was contributing to 3 of those 4 journals with Waldo Frank. Now, as it says here, Warren attended Princeton at the same time as Alan Dulles, and even shared at least one social group at Princeton, which was the American Whig Society. I don't know whether they kept in contact after they graduated, but I'm going to look into that to see if they did. And in the mid-1930s, Elba broke off all contact with the family and friends, just went off the grid. Didn't have a name listed on the roll of voters, wasn't in the census at all, wasn't in any phone books at all. And in one of her letters to Warren, she makes reference, not to Waldo I should say, she makes a comment on the lines of, I really shouldn't be telling you this, but several years ago I did something really, really terrible. I haven't told anyone, and if I did tell you what it is, you would understand why I can't tell anyone. And right at the end of the letter, in block letter, she says, "Please destroy this letter." Well, obviously Waldo never did. And now question is so what actually happened, because she wasn't in contact with her family. And in my visit to the States last year, prior to that, I was able to track down a friend of the family, an elderly woman who knew the family, and she confirmed that the family lost contact with Elba in the mid-1930s and never heard from her again. Elba was raised in in San Francisco. She went to New York at the age of about 29 when she married, and being New York in the early 1900s, she was very much a society girl. She was always being mentioned in the papers, always. They had a special, the social pages of the day would always mention Elva, all her friends. Then when she moved to New York, dead silence. She just didn't want to know anyone anywhere. This is the interesting bit. Elva's daughter Rowena obtained her BA and MA in psychology. She was just 4 months shy of obtaining her doctorate in psychology when she died. This is in December 1966. She was in the Standish Arms Hotel, and it's a 12-storey building, and this particular evening a fire started on the 10th floor. There was a faulty wire. It was winter, so I suspect it was probably a blanket, electric blanket. This woman on the 10th floor went to go to the bathroom. She came back, her bed was alight. She then tried to put it out herself, no success, so she then called the manager downstairs. He came up, tried putting it out, couldn't do it. He then called his brother, who was the maintenance guy. He came up, they couldn't do it. They then called the fire brigade, by which time it was too
Call the
late.
fire brigade first.
I'm sorry?
Call the fire brigade first.
Yeah, that's what they should have done, but they didn't. They were all trying to do their bit to put it out, but it didn't happen. When the fire brigade arrived, the ladder was short of her window by about 2.5 feet. And there were photographers at the time, I didn't have it here, but her clothes were on fire. You can see her silhouetted against the fire. Her clothes and her hair were on fire. She jumped. They reached for she reached for the fire brigade guy, missed, and she fell to her death. And she was 35, 36 or something at the time. That was on the 30th of December. About 10 days later, her good friend Waldo Frank died. So in that short period of time, Elva lost her daughter and her good friend Waldo. Now what's of interest is when I mentioned Alameda County, what's not generally known is that Earl Warren was the district attorney for Alameda County. And this is a scan from one of Elva's letters, and she says that Earl Warren is an old friend of hers. So they're probably mixed in the same circles in San Francisco. What the nature of the friendship was over the years, whether they kept in contact, I don't know. But it's just interesting that a founding member of the Fair Play to Cuba Committee was an old friend of Earl Warren, and I dare say that Earl Warren kept that quiet at the time. Now, the FPCC, they continued on. They didn't wind up after JFK's death, as is generally believed. It spread across America, but also up into Canada. And as you can see on the document on the left, the summer 1968 edition of the Fair Play to Cuba Committee Bulletin. This is from the same document. They even had their banquet, the 7th annual Fair Play banquet in Toronto, and there's a good crowd there. There's probably 40, 50 people in that banquet, and they were still producing literature. You could still purchase stuff from them. I don't know when they wound up in Canada, but they were still going, 5 years after JFK died. All right, summary of discoveries so far. At least 4 of the founding members had connections to JFK, and one was an old friend of Chief Justice Earl Warren. The founders were interlinked by common friendship, some going back to 1917, because the typical, as I said earlier, the 6 degrees of separation, that people knew people and people were introduced to other people, so they were all kind of pulled together towards the end. They were active in arranging demonstrations, parties, picnics, Spanish lessons, cheap trips to Cuba. They even had a banquet committee. They were very social, but very much involved in getting the public into their fold. Now, number 4, lack of information connecting almost all the founding members to the F.P.C.C. after the New York Times advert indicate that they only loaned their names. And I've gone through the journals, the Fair Play journals and the Student Journal. There's no mention of Waldo Frank or Elva Depew Matthews or George Albert Thurston. They've just lent their name to the organisation for the ad, and that was it. The active founding members were Robert Tabor, Richard Gibson and Vincent T. Lee. Contrary to popular belief, the F.P.C.C. didn't close in December '63, but continued in Canada until at least winter 1968. The youngest founding member was aged 28, the oldest was 75. and the average age was 44. This is just a very brief link diagram showing that there's 4 founding members. Norman Mailer, he was friends and neighbours with Jacques Lowe, who was JFK's personal photographer. Waldo Frank was friends with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was friend and special assistant to JFK. Truman Capote was friends with Lee Radziwill, sister-in-law to JFK. And Albert P. Matthews was an old friend of Earl Warren's. Now, just a caution, just because someone knows someone doesn't infer anything untoward about their friendship. We don't want to be guilty of guilt by association. Now, the reason I say this is some years ago I was giving a presentation on JFK's death at a conference for insurance investigators for the company that I worked for. And just through common links, there were 80 people in the auditorium. I was able to connect everyone in the auditorium to Lee Harvey Oswald. And the reason I did that was because the manager of the day more or less made an edict that no one in the investigations department was to be friends with external investigators. And that just created an uproar because the manager believed that the external investigators were criminal, therefore don't involve yourself with them. But you've got to be friends with people. You can't just stop people from being friends. So my comment there is, if someone is a friend with someone, it doesn't mean there's anything untoward about it. Look at the context of it. How do they know each other? For how long and why? Now, this might be a little bit hard to read. I found this document, actually it's a print I made about Oswald being in Houston with the FPCC. There's a couple called Laura and Fred Brody. They were 2 Socialist Workers' Party members, and I'll read it out to you, the interesting bit. It says, I had to ask them back to get them going, but they were absolutely convinced at the time that Oswald was a government agent. He just didn't know anything that would make one an advocate of fair play with Cuba. And when he tried to talk about Marx or socialism, it wags like something rehearsed from the CIA fact book. This actually confirms documentary evidence that Oswald was working as an FBI informant at that time. So here was a group of Socialist Workers' Party members in Houston saying that Oswald was there, trying to ingratiate himself into them, and they just weren't convinced. And that's it. Thanks to Bart Camp for the invitation.
You're most welcome.
Thanks to Stuart Galloway for organising the seminar. And my fellow Aussie researchers, Greg Parker and Kate Willard, for their insight and suggestions. Because when I made some of the discoveries, I'd send them text messages saying, hey, get a load of this. And they would come back with, some of the canned comments. So, thanks very much to them.
Thank you very much indeed. Well done, mate.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Have we got time for it?
Yeah, we have.
All right.
We're still half an hour
Can
away.
you tell us a bit about when the documents came out about 18 months ago, the record releases? There was a story, if I'm not mistaken, in the Miami Herald about the number 2 in the FPCC, basically
Vincent T. Lee?
CIA asset. You know about this?
Was that Vincent T. Lee?
Sorry?
Vincent T. Lee?
Well, that's what I don't know. That's the bit I don't remember. But I know that he was the number 2 inside the FPCC, as according to the article.
But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm still digging. It's possible.
Okay.
I mean, it's a sort of organisation that they would have infiltrated. I mean, I've got my doubts about Richard Gibson. He made it quite clear, from 1950, he wanted to be a member of the CIA. So it wouldn't surprise me if someone was there.
I remember somebody remarking, like, isn't it a bit of a joke of the fact that, first of all, Oswald, while in New Orleans, was having a little bit of a run-in with the members of the DRE, which were basically supported by the CIA as such.
Yep.
Yet at the same time, he was promoting a company like the FPCC, of which the number 2 was actually the CIA asset as well. So I'm talking about the bullshit games basically happening as such behind the curtains.
Yeah, I think the bullshit games were intentional. That the CIA would have used people for their purposes, what they wanted done at that time. Who the CIA members were, or the informants, Again, I tend to think Richard Gibson was probably working for him at that time. He then rolled over in about 1962-63, but he made it known from the outset he wanted employment and long-term retirement benefits. That's what he was looking at.
And my follow-up question is this, because I'm not that well read about the FPCC, but in what sense was it connected to communism? And was it basically seen as a communist organisation back in that time?
No, I've never. There were former members who did have connections to the Communist Party of old, but none of them were active members of the Communist Party at that time. I think they just lent their name to it, and it was just those 3 active members. The rest, that's when it like L.W. Matthews, she had there was no comment in any of her letters to Waldo Frank about the FPCC.
Right.
George Albert Thurston, nothing. He was just a commercial artist and an unionist, so it doesn't make him a communist.
Okay, then I've got one more question that I just thought about.
Yeah.
The thing about Oswald was his own entity basically running the FPCC in New Orleans
Yep.
as such, and that he just basically wrote a letter to the head honchos in New York.
Yep, in New York, yep.
About setting up a chapter of that in New Orleans. Was there any indication that he was going to do the same in Dallas, or?
No, I've read nothing of that nature.
Right.
My understanding is that Gilberto Lopez, I think it is, the guy who was supposed to be the patsy, fulfill the Oswald role for the Tampa.
Yeah.
If you went on Tampa. I gather that he also set up a chapter of the FPCC in Tampa.
In Tampa.
Yeah.
It's possible. Again, I haven't looked into Lopez at this stage. I'm kind of working my way out from the founding members and to who was based where, because there were 7,000 members across the country. So possibly.
And light-hearted comment. I saw Kenneth Tynan up there.
Yep.
And he was actually the first man, the first person to use the F word on British
That's
television.
right, yeah. I made a reference to that. He was being interviewed on TV, and it happens, Yeah.
Can you just say what the Eastland Committee was?
The Eastland Committee was part of the House Un-Americans Committee set up by Senator James Eastland, and they were looking into communist infiltration into, I know, scary, into America. And particularly with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, you can see that they started on the 6th of April, and within weeks they were sending out subpoenas to the founding members because they were concerned that the communists were going to have too much of an influence in America. So, as part of the House Un-Americans Committee, they were looking into left-wing organisations. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was one of them, but there were dozens and dozens of them across America.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry,
Yeah.
following on from that, some of the research I'm doing at the moment, one of the interesting things is that Oswald was never called before the Un-Americans Committee, and that was primarily, in my opinion, because Robert Webster was. So because they overlap so much, so the timeline,
Yep.
the Un-American Committee paid for Webster to be set up in his hotel, and he gave sort of for several days, and my gut feeling is that Oswald probably would have been called before it, but it was going to be such a similar tale to Webster that they didn't call him, because people go, well, why, as a defector coming back, why wasn't he called before?
I think it was only a matter of time, but again, by the same token, I don't believe Oswald's defection was genuine, and there may have been very much like a better term, a protection order over him, a hands-off approach, so they didn't call him.
Also, they worked like any committee in certain periods of the year with breaks for holidays and things.
That's right.
So it often fell that if you got back at a certain period and Oswald came a bit later, they were already on their summer break or their autumn break. So there was a certain amount of luck or whatever about it.
Yeah, or they might have just considered him to be not a threat.
Yeah.
Might have not been any real interest in him if he was just a member and not really doing anything, because we know he didn't do really anything to get any other member in. So he might have been considered just, blamed, very much.
But of course they did call some of the students that went to, those 300 students that
Yes,
after
they
the
did.
FPCC came back from Cuba, and they were threatened quite strongly. Have you looked into that element of it?
Not yet, but I will
Alright.
be, yes, because there were 300 students, I do have an old Time magazine article where there was a young man, I think he was 19, 20 years old, long hair, and they showed him in a barbershop getting a haircut for his trip over to Cuba. And they mentioned, in those days, they would mention someone's name and their address, which we just don't do these days. So, yeah, it's quite possible that they were looking at the students, but nothing really much came of that as far as I'm aware.
Just a general point really, I think it's a great example of what's quite a small area of the whole picture, but then when you look into a tiny little bit, it then blows up into quite a huge piece of research that has an interesting cast of characters with all the different links that you show. I think there's obviously been some writings where people have said the whole thing was set up as a kind of CIA operation. I think when you've listed the names there certainly weren't communist, but they were all lefty, liberal people with those kind of inklings. And I think probably the most likely explanation is the intelligence agencies, not just the CIA, but the others as well, would then infiltrate and then use it for their purposes.
Yeah.
But from what Will was saying in Tampa and with Oswald in New Orleans, if they're the only person as a part of the chapter, then those specific chapters would then possibly more likely to be suspiciously set up
Yeah,
for other
they're working like
means.
as a honey trap organisation.
Exactly, yeah.
That's
Sorry.
quite likely.
And one of the other points is because the FBI were desperate to find out that the money for financing it some of it was coming from Cuba itself.
That's right, yes, it was.
And some of that money was actually coming to them via Canada. So they used Canada as a banking facility to get the money to the F.P.C.C. via Canada.
Yeah, well, it was Tabor, Alice, and his friendship with Charles Santos Bush. It was Charles Santos Bush who said that he received the money from Rolito Ria, I think his name was. Yeah, Rolito Roa, I should say, from the Cuban mission in New York. Where that money came from, whether it was through Canada or whether it was from Cuba, it did come from the Cuban government ostensibly.
Regarding Oswald in New Orleans, Louisiana at the time had very draconian anti-communist laws, and any organisation that had any link to anybody linked with communism could be severely prosecuted. And a theory has been put forward that Oswald was asked to join the F.P.C.C. so they could link it to communism and prosecute it. But whether there was anything else in Louisiana that they could prosecute, I don't know. But it was put forward that Bannister persuaded him to, as part of his anti-communist.
Again, I don't know about that. It's possible, but again, I haven't, it's an area that I haven't looked into yet. But I've started with the founding members and I'm working my way out.
The founding members are all New York and California, aren't they? So
they wouldn't
it's as far away from people in the
Protestant
South.
organisations
Unusual.
under this law, but then it was overturned in Washington by, apparently it was unconstitutional. So, but they did go after quite a lot of these left-wing, well, not left-wing organisations. They went after these like the NACCP and all the civil rights.
They are left-wing, they're just not that far left-wing.
They tried to say they were all connected to communism and therefore they could be prosecuted under this special law, but it fails in the end.
And of course, if you look at the V.T. Lee letters to Oswald, they're very guarded. They're telling him not to do things, and Oswald is just ignoring them and setting up and saying he's got the office and,
Is it something that please don't
Please
proceed
don't,
without further
yeah.
You
guidance?
were
And,
probably aware of the laws in
Yeah.
Louisiana.
Yeah.
or that it was a bit suspicious what this guy's
Yeah.
trying to do in the deep south here.
So can I just clarify something here?
Yeah.
Did you not say earlier on that V.T. Lee was quite possibly the CIA guy who succeeded Gibson? Or have I
Well,
mixing
no, he
names up
succeeded
there?
Gibson.
Indeed.
I don't know whether he had any CIA affiliations. I haven't found any.
Oh,
But
okay.
it did say he was in
Okay.
was in a military academy in New Jersey. That's where he received some.
So he had some military, so he certainly
He's had
got some
military training in New
possible.
Jersey.
It just strikes me as interesting that you have this one CIA guy writing guardedly. But I just wondered if this is just all smoke and mirrors between the two of them.
Well, I could
Just
very well
creating a paper trail.
yeah.
I don't know.
Again, I've got my doubts about Richard Gibson, but it
Okay.
stands to reason that they would have another member in there to take his place if Richard Gibson, should fall under a bus or whatever. So it makes sense, but at this stage I haven't found anything of that nature.
And you did make a good point, I thought, as well, that like 15 years after the end of the war, it's not unusual for a lot of the people to have military experience as well.
Yeah, well, it was the Cold War, and after the Second World War, then there was the Korean War. So it stands to reason a lot of them had military experience.
And of course, Richard Gibson gets set up by certainly one of our favourite CIA assets, June. He falls for her, and she gets Richard Gibson drunk at one point, trying to get information out of him.
Yeah.
So they're getting at him by honey traps as well.
Well, I think they had the financial hold over him because the documents that were released last November, October, it makes it clear in the discussions they had with him that Gibson said that money is important to him and he wanted the long-term benefits, including retirement benefits from the CIA. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, no more questions?